All right, let's just jump right into this. Today, we are exploring what is arguably one of the most widely read and definitely one of the most provocative papers in the modern sustainability field. It's called Deep Adaptation, a map for navigating climate tragedy, and it was written by Professor Jem Bendell. Now, just a quick heads up, what we're looking at in this explainer isn't your typical run-of-the-mill environmental assessment. It's actually a really profound, deeply curious exploration into a controversial possibility. It tackles the idea that near-term societal collapse due to climate change isn't just some distant, far-off risk anymore, but is actually already inevitable. Yeah, it's a heavy topic for sure, but analyzing this source material is just incredibly illuminating.
So for decades now, the mainstream conversation around the environment has been heavily anchored by this one specific narrative. If we act right now, we can still fix this, right? We hear about carbon taxes, green energy, sustainable corporate practices, the whole shebang. But Bendell completely hooks his readers right from the jump by shattering that familiar framework. He asks a seriously disruptive question. What if we're already past the point of no return? What if it is mathematically and physically too late to avert catastrophe? And what's absolutely crucial to understand here is that this isn't just some abstract philosophical musing. It's a structural challenge to the entire multi-billion-dollar sustainability industry. In fact, the entire Deep Adaptation paper was sparked by that exact realization. Bendell, who is a veteran in the corporate sustainability space himself, basically looked around, asked this question, and found, well, total silence. The experts, the researchers, the professionals, they were largely avoiding this terrifying premise altogether. They were basically operating entirely on the assumption that our civilization could be sustained. So Bendell decided to take a massive step back. He spent months analyzing the raw, unvarnished climate data, just to see what happens when we assume the worst-case scenario is actually already here.
And he didn't just arrive at this conclusion on a whim. He anchors his whole argument in some seriously stark, hard climate data. The core argument in his paper is that our traditional mitigation efforts, things like cutting emissions incrementally, they're basically being outpaced by what the scientific community calls nonlinear changes. Okay, so the main issue with standard climate models, according to Bendell's analysis, is their historic reliance on linear projections. Official panels like the IPCC have generally projected that temperatures and environmental impacts will rise steadily, right alongside our carbon output. But Bendell points out they have consistently, almost predictably, underestimated the actual pace of warming. What we are witnessing right now are nonlinear changes. We're talking about sudden, exponential spikes and drops in the natural world that just don't correlate smoothly with human carbon emissions anymore. The Earth's systems are reacting so much faster and way more unpredictably than those baseline models ever anticipated.
Just to really put the sheer momentum of this into perspective, 17 of the 18 warmest years in the entire 136-year historical record have occurred since 2001. Literally, 17 out of 18. That is a staggering statistic. Think about that for a second. If you were born after 2001, almost your entire life has been lived in the absolute hottest anomalies in recorded history. Now, the ambient temperature rise is undisputed at this point, but it's the cascading effects of this heat that trigger the true alarm bells in Bendell's research.
So this brings us to a really crucial concept: runaway climate change. It's defined here as a cascade of active, interrelated tipping points that take the Earth to a hotter state via unstoppable amplifying feedbacks. It's basically like a giant planetary domino effect. And the math behind this runaway effect is pretty striking. The paper cites researchers who identified 15 potential global tipping points. Well, according to their data, 9 out of those 15 are already showing signs of being active. Let's look at exactly what those active, cascading tipping points look like right now, out in the real world. The paper fires off this just staggering list of environmental impacts. Arctic sea ice volume. It's sitting at historic lows, decreasing by about 13.2% per decade. Greenland is shedding an unbelievable 280 gigatons of ice every single year. Sea level rise is currently trending non-linearly. We've actually already lost 50% of global coral reefs in just the last 30 years. And on top of all that, a rapidly warming Arctic is destabilizing the jet streams, which directly causes those extreme weather blocks we are seeing globally today. Bendell's point is that these aren't just isolated random events, they are interconnected dominoes, and they're already falling.
But the paper doesn't just leave us with environmental data. It forces a pretty dramatic shift in the narrative focus. We have to move away from these abstract atmospheric metrics and start looking at the visceral human impacts of these ecological changes. Because at the end of the day, the real question becomes, what actually happens to us when our environment shifts this dramatically?
And that leads to Bendell's extremely blunt definition of societal collapse: the uneven ending of our normal modes of sustenance, shelter, security, pleasure, identity, and meaning. Now really notice that word uneven. This doesn't mean some sudden, dramatic Hollywood disaster movie where the whole world just ends overnight. No, it means a gradual, fragmented breakdown. It's a scenario where one city might face extreme food shortages, while another city, maybe just a few hundred miles away, seems entirely normal for a few more years. It's this slow unraveling of the daily survival systems that we all kind of just take for granted right now.
To illustrate what this breakdown could actually look like, the paper points to some projected agricultural data. Standard climate models predict just absolutely devastating hits to global agriculture by the end of the century. We are looking at projected declines that directly threaten our global sustenance. China's corn yields dropping by over 45%, rice yields down by more than 36%, India facing a 15 to 25% reduction in wheat yields. When you combine those kinds of exponential hits to the food supply with a constantly growing global population, Bendell argues that the structural integrity of global society is going to be placed under just unimaginable stress.
And Bendell intentionally uses this really jarring, unacademic language to drive the point home. He writes, "With the power down, soon you wouldn't have water. You will depend on your neighbors for food and some warmth." By stripping away all that sterile scientific jargon, the paper grounds the abstract data in a highly visceral human reality. It forces the reader to really sit there and confront what living through a collapse actually feels like on, say, a random Tuesday morning.
Which naturally leads to the big question that the paper forces us to ask ourselves. If the trajectory is really as dire as Bendell suggests, why is the broader scientific and sustainability community still mostly focused on incremental steps? Like, why are we still arguing over banning plastic straws instead of openly talking about this bigger picture?
Well, the paper addresses this brilliantly by exploring our own psychological defense mechanisms. It draws on sociology to contrast two really subtle forms of denial. First, there's interpretive denial. This is where, we accept the facts, but we actively interpret them in a way that just makes us feel a little bit safer. Then there's implicative denial. This is when we fully recognize the troubling implications, but we busy ourselves with trivial green activities, like meticulously sorting our recycling into the perfect bins, just to feel some sense of control. It helps us avoid the terrifying reality that a systemic collapse probably isn't going to be solved by a blue bin. Bendell suggests that even the most dedicated environmentalists use these exact tools to protect their own psychology. And importantly, it's not just personal psychology. It's a systemic issue. Bendell outlines why the scientific community actively softens its own warnings. There's this thing called scientific reticence, which is a well-documented tendency for scientists to err on the side of least drama to protect their professional credibility. Then, there's a very genuine fear among experts that dropping the unvarnished truth will just trigger mass public hopelessness and doom, which might paralyze any action at all. And finally, you have institutional and funding pressures. I mean, let's be real, you simply do not get grant money to research problems that you've already declared unsolvable. According to the paper, all of this creates a massive, truly dangerous gap between scientific reality and public awareness.
So what actually happens when you strip all that denial away? If you accept the core premise of this paper, that some form of societal collapse is now inevitable, how do you even get out of bed in the morning? Well, this is where Bendell transitions the paper from a diagnosis of pure doom into a framework for finding meaning and even joy in the face of tragedy. He calls it the Deep Adaptation Agenda.
Deep adaptation is essentially built on 4 core pillars. Think of it as a map for navigating this unfolding crisis. First up is resilience, figuring out what core values, norms, and behaviors we truly want to preserve as things around us change. Then comes relinquishment. This one's tough. It's actively identifying what consumer habits or expectations we simply have to let go of so we don't make matters worse. Third is restoration, asking what ancient or forgotten practices we can actually bring back to help us survive and connect with one another. And finally, reconciliation, recognizing our shared predicament and asking what and who shall we make peace with as the world fundamentally changes.
And this brings us to a profoundly moving concept discussed in the text Radical Hope. You see, when standard hope, the hope that our current way of life will just continue uninterrupted forever, when that is lost, what takes its place? The paper draws on how ancient indigenous cultures faced their own catastrophes. For example, when Native American tribes were forced onto reservations, they faced the literal end of their known world. Their leaders had to employ what is called imaginative excellence. They had to figure out entirely new ethical values that would be needed in a completely new, totally unthinkable reality.
And honestly, that is the ultimate challenge Professor Bendell's paper leaves us with. It stops asking how we can save our current civilization and instead asks, how can we find our own radical hope? As we navigate the complex, nonlinear realities ahead of us, what ethical values will you rely on to creatively adapt to whatever comes next? It's a pretty heavy but totally fascinating question to ponder. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see y'all next time.